Hello, and welcome to the first in a new series, simply entitled How to Cook Pumpkin. It's going to be a short series, just one episode. Will it be recommissioned? How to cook squashes, how to cook onions. Maybe could do a slightly funnier title, Know Your Onions. I don't know, fingers crossed though, that it does indeed get recommissioned. But as I said, short series, How to Cook Pumpkin, one episode long. Here are some interesting facts about pumpkins. Australians are obsessed with pumpkins. They are so obsessed with pumpkins that they use the term for all kinds of vegetables which aren't pumpkins. For instance, squashes. So a butternut squash is called a butternut squash. However, in Australia, it's called a butternut pumpkin. Don't know why, not a pumpkin. It's a squash. That's the only... No, I have another interesting fact, but I'll come to that in a second, because that is relative to how you cook a pumpkin, and I will get there as we cook the pumpkin. So, for the purposes of this demonstration, I am using a Kent pumpkin, but you could use any kind of pumpkin, with the exception of a butternut pumpkin, because it's not a pumpkin, it's a squash. What I'm going to do is take out the centre of this Kent pumpkin. I'll probably save the seeds because I like to bake them, and sprinkle them on salads. So I'm going to take out this bit. You won't need help on this. This is dead easy. Just use a small knife. So, small knife, cut out the fibrous centre of the Kent pumpkin. Keep the seeds so that you can bake them and sprinkle them on salads. You do not need to do that. Okay, take out the seeds. Voila. Now, this is an important bit. So, I've often seen people prepare pumpkin by cutting it up to make it manageable. I'm going to do that. And then taking off the skin. I'm not going to do that because that is dangerous horse shit. If you are told to take the skin off a pumpkin, unless you're boiling it, which I wouldn't do unless you're making a soup, and even then I'm not sure I'd do it. I think I'd still roast it and then puree it. So actually, yeah, if you're told to take the skin off a pumpkin, call dangerous horse shit, and no longer be friends with the person that told you. If you were friends with them, you might not be. They might just have stopped you in the street and told you to take the skin off a pumpkin, in which case, call the police. We're gonna cut this up into manageable sizes. We're gonna start with cutting them into half moons. They're already half moons, not a full moon. There's a joke there, and I'm gonna leave the skin on. Okay, so big knife, very important, and you've got to be careful. You don't actually have to be careful here that you don't cut yourself. They're tough suckers, so big sharp knife is good, lots of weight on it. Cut it in half like that. Now, here's the thing. Look at the thickness of that. I'm actually going to cut it in half that away now, but leave it intact, and then roast it like that. I'm not going to make it any smaller than that. I'm not going to cut it into little bits or chunks or slivers or anything like that, because I don't actually want it to cook quickly, and I will explain why in a second. So that is how I'm going to roast it. You could cut it again in half there, but I'm not going to, and this is why. So the reason that we've left the skin on is because it's going to make this much more manageable as it roasts, because you'll have to turn it a couple of times. in the oven, and you don't want it falling apart, and you don't want, when you release it from the tray that it's baking on, it's roasting on, you don't want to break up the flesh, because that's when it starts to all come apart and sort of turns into a puree, which you might be familiar with. So we're going to leave this on because it holds the whole thing together, and it just makes it a lot more manageable in the oven. Also, you can eat it. I think it's delicious. Some people hate it. They think it's too bitter or too tough, but they probably think it's too tough because they haven't cooked it properly, and they think it's too bitter because they don't have an evolved palate. I really like the bitterness, and this becomes very, very sweet, and I'm going to tell you, I'm going to link all this up in just a second. So the bitterness is actually a nice foil for it. But look, I'm not saying you have to eat the skin. You don't. Once it's roasted to perfection, you can just, with a very sharp knife, or actually you can actually just peel this off. If you cooked it properly, you can just peel off, or you can take a knife and just very easily remove the skin, and then you've got a still intact body of pumpkin, which will eat really well. Now, the reason that I'm keeping it fairly large, and the reason that I'm definitely keeping the skin on, is because this vegetable is very starchy. Now, starchy vegetables are beautiful things to cook because they are they're very versatile depending on what you want that starch to do. Now, starch under heat converts itself into maltose, which is a kind of sugar, and it does this up until about 75 degrees Celsius. Once the temperature that is cooking this exceeds 75 degrees Celsius, the starch will stop turning itself into maltose. So we want to cook this slowly. The longer that we can subject it to the lower range of temperature, up to 75 degrees Celsius, the more starch will turn itself into a sugar, and the sweeter this will become. So we want it to cook slowly. So we've got to get the temperature in the oven spot on, and we need to cut it so it's quite a sizable chunk, which will slow the cooking process down. If you chop it into loads of little bits, it'll cook really, really quickly. Only the outside starches, which are exposed to the most heat, will do anything at all, and they'll rapidly cook, and they won't have time under slow, gentle heat to turn themselves into sugars, and they will just blacken and burn, and then you'll get a horrible crispy exterior, and inside will be raw, and that will go in the bin. So we cut it into a fairly large size, and we get the temperature right. The temperature needs to be 170 degrees. Now, I've done it at higher and I've done it at lower. 170 is the best. You would think that if you cooked it at 75 degrees as a maximum for the entire time, then you would get something which was incredible, because it would just, all the starch would turn to sugar. So, I mean, you just have a syrup. But the other thing about starches is that they actually absorb moisture from the other cells in the makeup of this vegetable. And so they can dry out and go quite mealy. So you've got to get the cooking time right. You want to subject the starch to temperatures low enough to release enough sugar to get the required taste, but you also want to cook it quick enough so the whole thing doesn't dry out, the starch doesn't absorb all the moisture from all of the cells that make up this beautiful vegetable, and then turn it into this mealy, dry mess. So that's why it's a little bit tricky to cook, on the grounds that can't cook it too long, can't cook it too fast, can't cook it at the wrong temperature, got to get it right. Welcome back to part 2 of this limited one-part series, How to Cook Pumpkin. God, what a schoolboy error. Right, what we're going to do now is season and oil the pumpkin. I like to do this in a bowl. Here's the bowl. Here's the pumpkin. Right, ready? This needs to be on film for sure. Right, pumpkin's in a bowl. We're now going to put oil on it. You could use any kind of oil depending on the desired outcome. I'm going for a bit of a Mediterranean theme, so I'm doing olive oil. Yay much. I don't know how much that was, but actually if you measured it out separately, I think you would find that it was yay. Season it, salt and pepper. Now, you can do all kinds of things to this. Lots of people put balsamic on it, or pomegranate molasses, if you're A, posh, or B, have ever been to Ottolenghi. But because of the aforementioned production of sugar during a slow cooking process, I don't really see the need for that. It will just put lots more sugar on the outside of the dish, of the ingredient, and that will caramelize really, really quickly, potentially burn, and just add more sweetness, unless it burns, in which case it becomes bitter. But if it doesn't burn, it will just add more sweetness to an ingredient which is, by the end of the cooking process, going to be inherently sweet. So I like to go with more savoury flavours. But if you are going to put dukkha on it, or even a spice, I wouldn't put it on towards the end of the cooking process, because it's going to colour and potentially burn over the time that it takes to cook the pumpkin. And time is incredibly important when you cook pumpkin, just like it is, just as the temperature is very, very important, so is time. If you're cooking at 170 and you've cut your pumpkin to approximately this size, you're looking at 45 to 55 minutes, really no longer. That is the slot. That's the time that you're looking for. So season it. I'm going to put pepper on this in a second, but I can't because I'm holding the phone, and I've only got one spare hand, and it's a grinder. I pestled my salt, which was why I was able to do it one-handed, but I haven't bothered to do that with the pepper. There's going to be a third part to this in just a second, which is actually a third, and then there will be a fourth, but the fourth will come much later. It'll be like here's one I did earlier, but in real time. It's just that I won't film that next 45 to 50 minutes, because God, that would be dull. More dull than this. Thanks for coming back. Right, pepper goes on, and then we're going to put the pumpkin onto a tray. So, if you've got good non-stick trays, you don't need baking parchment. If you don't trust your trays, if they're old and knackered, then maybe put down some baking parchment. What should happen is, when you put the flesh down onto the tray, as it cooks and as it starts to form a crust over time, it should come away quite easily. So when you get a spatula and just lift it off, turn it round to get the non-touching flesh side in contact with the hot tray, it should just come away really easily. But if your trays are rubbish, then it might cause a problem. It might come away leaving the caramelised side attached, and then it starts to become fibrous. You're exposing the centre of it, and you've removed the caramelised part, and that can ruin it. Actually, that can make it break down when you're cooking, so that becomes a big problem. So if you don't trust your pans put down parchment baking paper, so it doesn't stick. But I do trust these pans. If you really don't, if all of that just seems too much, then another great reason that you've still got the skin on is you can put the skin onto the tray, like so the flesh never touches the tray, and that's its own built-in non-stick. You can do that, and then all of it is exposed to the heated air in the oven, and that's fine, but it doesn't colour as nicely. So if you do trust your equipment, I put it flesh side down like that, and halfway through the cooking process, you're going to flip it. So this is what we do. This is there's no oil on this tray because all the oil went into the bowl on top of the pumpkin, and we don't want to make it too oily. That's it, there, bang. And then the remaining oil you can just pour over like so. Now there are some recipes I've seen which say that you should steam the pumpkin first and then roast it. Again, that watchword, dangerous horse shit. If you do that, you are completely obliterating the chance of producing any kind of sweetness from it, because when you boil it, it will come up beyond 75 degrees very, very quickly, so none of the starch will turn into sugars. It just won't have the opportunity. You'll get this sort of soft mid result, which won't have much sweetness to it at all, and then you'll roast it, and sure, it might colour quickly and look quite nice if it doesn't fall apart, but it won't taste anywhere near as delicious as if you slow roast it. So that's why we don't steam it or boil it before we roast it. We just do a single cooking method. And this will now go into the oven at 170, and in 45 to 50 minutes I'm going to pull it out after I've turned it once halfway through the cooking process. You do the maths, and then that'll be it, and I'll show you the end result, which should be perfect. If it's not, I'll have to redo it, the whole thing, off camera until it is correct, and then show you those results and lie to you by saying that was the original pumpkin that you saw. Obviously that won't happen. I'm a professional. Right, final part of this limited cooking series. This is the denouement, or the money shot, some would say. Here we have, coming out of the oven, our gloriously roasted pumpkins. It's going to go up here. Shut the oven. Now, these were actually, I turned these 3 times, but the 3rd time was just to get the large side of this one and this one touching metal to caramelise a little bit, mainly for aesthetics. I'm all about aesthetics in cooking. And so you will be able to see that's nice and golden and caramelised all around here. So too, this, I'm just going to use a little step. Look at that. It's a thing of beauty. And to test if it's cooked or not, you take a knife. I'm using a filleting knife, but you don't need to do that. Just a thin bladed sharp knife. Just put it straight in. It should go in really easily, but when it comes out, it's clean, a little bit like baking, but also you can see that it's not all falling apart. It's actually, it's still very hot, but it's actually very robust. You can flick it around and it's not going to go to mush or fall apart because you kept it in those lovely big pieces with the rind, the outer still on, and also you cooked it at the right temperature for the right amount of time. These took 50 minutes exactly. They've been for 50 minutes, turned 3 times. Could have turned them twice, that would have been absolutely fine. The third turn was, as I said, just for aesthetics. There you go, that's it. That's how to cook beautiful pieces of pumpkin without them becoming a horrible, mushy mess or a burnt, undercooked, mealy maelstrom. Will the show get recommissioned? Don't know. Don't think so. Don't know. Stay tuned. Or not. Well, bye-bye now.